Hello, dear friends. Once again with another edition of the Think Tank Talk. Today we are focusing on what China has achieved in the last few decades. Now, the Central Economic Work Conference, it's a forum that basically reviews the economic performance of the economy every year. It met in Beijing on December 11th and the 12th. The forum was informed that despite slower than expected economic growth in 2024, the country managed to achieve the GDP target of about 5%. This is a huge achievement, keeping in view the headwinds that economies across the world have been facing. Now, the Central Economic Work Conference emphasized developing new quality productive forces to build a modern industrial economy, highlighting the Artificial Intelligence Plus initiative to integrate AI with other sectors. Now, the forum committed to continue the drive to excellence in all sectors of life. Now, this begs a question: what actually drives China? How has China gotten here? Now, to get an answer to this, I sat down with Hamid Sharif. He's a former managing director with the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank in Beijing. He also served as a country director for the Asian Development Bank in Beijing itself before joining the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. As a whole, Hamid Sharif spent over a decade in Beijing to get a sense of how China works and how it got here. One of the few foreigners, actually, with deep insights into the Chinese social and professional life. So I asked Hamid Sharif, what drives China?
I think China's growth is really remarkable. I mean, they've lifted 800 million people out of poverty in about 4 decades. And so what has been the success factors? I think there are several. I'll mention those which come to my mind immediately. One would be, I think, the commitment to economic reform and openness, especially after Deng Xiaoping. When he came into power, just before that, in the final years of Mao, he had the opportunity to travel abroad after many decades. And when he went abroad, I think he was absolutely shocked and surprised by how much the rest of the world had progressed and how backward China had become. So he started to think in his mind what would be the sort of key sectors. And amongst them were, obviously energy, chemical industry, the steel industry, etc. So he started to have some idea of the key sectors. But beyond that, I think there was a realization that the communist system which they had at that time wasn't working. And he then took on a very pragmatic approach. He said, look, I don't care whether the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. That's what we're concerned about. So we shouldn't get hung up on socialism, capitalism. Let's try what works for us. And hence, the phrase, you have socialism with Chinese characteristics. And those Chinese characteristics are bringing pragmatism to what was a very dogmatic view of state's role in running an economy. So you started to see the state embracing private sector, openness, opening the economy up to foreign direct investment. These were huge steps. And then allowing the Chinese entrepreneurs to also emerge. And the way the Chinese do this typically is they allow experimentation. So I think one of the promises, for example, if you take farming, up to that time there was collective farming in China, and basically you had to produce, and you were given a target, you had to produce so much crops, and you then hand them over. So what one of the promises did was they said, look, this is the target, but anything you make over the target is yours. Now that incentivized farmers to actually produce more. And in this way, you can see how they started to bring in mechanisms to incentivize farmers and other producers to produce more and keep the benefits of that. So I think the openness was extremely important. Secondly, I would say is that they realized that they had to export. So the whole industry was geared to export out of China, and that I think was key. And you can't do any of this without infrastructure. Infrastructure is a great enabler of economic growth. So, and amongst them, energy is key. So getting energy at an affordable rate to your industry, I think that's something they managed very well. Now, I say managed well, but it also had externalities which China later had to deal with. For example, they used a lot of coal, and that was cheap. It made sense for them at that time, but it led to a lot of pollution, which they now are dealing with. Logistics, roads. I mean, if you look at just the road network and the railway network which China has put up in the last few decades, it is very, very impressive. To the point where they've innovated, they've taken their electric rail system. It has the most extensive electric rail probably in the world. I mean, you can go from Beijing to Shanghai in 3 hours. Which is like going from Islamabad to Karachi, right? That I think is quite extraordinary. Then urbanization. I think they realized that majority of their people were living in the rural areas. To help them to upgrade and to provide services to them, you needed urbanization. And the sort of urbanization they opted for, and this really is key, wasn't a sprawling, California-style cities. They actually went into cities which were highly concentrated, or where the population density was extremely high. This allows the state to provide services much more efficiently and at a much lower cost. So you'll see a lot of vertical construction when you go to Chinese cities. So those I think were some of the key factors. And I think the advantage which China also had was that the communist system did leave much higher health and education indicators. So if you take China before opening up and compare it to India or even Pakistan, even though per capita Pakistan was actually higher than China at that time, but in terms of health and education indicators, we were far behind. Because the state had invested in people, and the state continued to invest in people as it opened up. And that I think has been a key for China's development. So it could convert that huge population into an advantage for itself, because by training them and educating them. In contrast, in Pakistan, we often say that we're a very youthful population, but it's a youthful population which we have not yet converted into an advantage because we haven't invested enough in development of that human capital.
Well, what you're saying is basically that the Chinese leadership prioritized investment in human capital, conscious that it is the key to economic and technological development. The citizen has been at the center of the policies?
Absolutely. I think there's just no question about that there's been a very, very high priority on developing human resources. And I've seen that firsthand in discussions with Chinese officials, that they're acutely aware that not everyone is going to be, a graduate, and not everyone is going to go to university, and that's not the path for everybody. So what you see in China is a lot of experimentation with technical and vocational education. And they've worked with everybody. Anyone who can help them in this, they've taken that help. So If you take some of the large German companies like Volkswagen, Volkswagen was one of the earliest, along with Audi, they were the earliest car producers to go to China. And with their cooperation, they set up technical and vocational education centers. They took loans from AIIB, World Bank for that purpose, again, to experiment. And then once they think something works, then they would, from their own resources, take it all across China. So it is a very extensive network of technical and vocational education centers. And that's something which the state really concentrates on.
Yeah, one tends to basically get into the Confucian thought that drives China. And that's why I would like to ask, what has been the role in the phenomenal development of China, of the conventional Chinese wisdom that is anchored in the Confucian thought, Confucian philosophy?
You know, there's a lot of learning on, a lot of emphasis on education and learning. I think there's a Confucius saying which says, never tire of learning and never tire of teaching others. And that, I think, is something which you see when you live in China. I was always struck, several times I would get into a taxi and the driver would be listening to something interesting. And I don't speak Chinese, but when my colleagues who did, and when I asked them who were with me in the taxi, look, what was he listening to? I would always be fascinated. Either they'd be listening to something quite technical, in something they were interested in, or it'd be a classic sort of a play. Very rarely would it be some idle music, you know, which didn't really contribute to anything. The other contrast I've seen in working in China, in contrast to South Asia, where I also worked a lot in international development, the Chinese officials are very keen to learn. And they're very humble about the learning. They will sit with anybody as long as they can learn. Whereas in South Asia, I think, you know, after a particular level official has reached, you know, we somehow feel we don't need to learn, or no one can teach us anything. And you see that in the way you interact. You know, I've interacted with officials when I contrast with China and other parts of Asia. It's very striking that the Chinese, no matter what level the official may be, he or she wants to learn. And if that means going somewhere, pursuing someone for that, if it's useful knowledge, they will go for it. And that, I think, has been a tremendous feature of China. And you see that reflected in the investments they've made in learning and education, the investment which has gone into innovation in China. I mean, cynically, when I moved in 2012, people were still saying, well, the Chinese, just like the Japanese and others, they can only just do rote learning, you know, they're not really, you know, the Chinese kids aren't innovative and so on. And fast forward 10 years and you see, you know, the China has innovated. I mean, WeChat, for example, you know, combines WhatsApp, a payment system, a video system, all rolled into one. And similarly, you see the breakthroughs in artificial intelligence in China, electrical vehicles, the battery technology, etc. So there is innovation. I don't think, you know, the old view of China just simply, you know, making its kids do rote learning, I don't think that's valid anymore.
What do actually the Belt and Road Initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank represent? What do these two concepts signify? Primarily a quest for political predominance outside China, or connectivity rooted in the concept of a win-win cooperation aimed at sharing the dividends of prosperity with other countries, with the neighborhood?
I think certainly China, if you look historically, China has never been a colonial power. But that doesn't mean that, you know, it wasn't interested in its neighborhood. It was very much interested in its neighborhood. And of course, you know, just Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom, It saw itself as the center. So it saw itself as a civilization which was prospering, which was an advanced civilization compared to others, and it wanted a recognition of that. So the tributary system which you had, where it wanted acknowledgement from others of its superiority, if you like, once it got that, it then reciprocated that tribute in a much bigger way by not only returning gifts which were much larger, but also giving access to trade and civilization. So if you look at, for example, Korea, I mean, the Korean language is very close to Chinese, and there's a reason for that, because there was that cultural exchange allowed as part of the tributary system. And China, therefore, because it doesn't have a colonial power, I think it sees trade as a way to advance links with the other countries, and that is what leads to peace. And I think Belt and Road Initiative, of course there's a large Chinese interest for it to succeed, because China needs markets, so it will create market. But on the other hand, it's also opening itself up for being a market to others. In that sense, it can be a win-win situation. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is not a Belt and Road institution as such, because it does projects outside of the Belt and Road Initiative as well. But I think it can complement BRI if the borrowing members wanted to do that. It is a bank which has emerged because I think there was a demand for much greater development finance. And unfortunately, if you look at the years before 2012, when AIIB was established, you can go to the minutes of the governors' meetings at the World Bank. Year after year after year, the Chinese were saying, please increase the capital of the bank, and also, of course, give greater voice to developing countries. And the Zadillo report, which the World Bank itself commissioned, had made recommendations for giving greater voice to the global south, if you like. But unfortunately, a lot of that fell on deaf ears. And I think when China realized that there was going to be no movement in the existing MDBs to increase capital or give greater voice to developing countries, at that point it initiated and took the lead for establishing the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And very soon that galvanized, and you had 55 founding members, and today, I haven't seen the latest number, but it's well over 100 members. So after the World Bank, it is the largest MDB in terms of membership. I think the good thing is that AIIB has proved its critiques wrong. The big fear of the Americans and the Europeans was, oh my goodness, here's a bank emerging. This will lower standards in terms of environment especially, and social standards and other ways of working. It hasn't done that. It has actually embraced those standards, and that's why World Bank and ADB and EBRD and in future, I'm sure, African Development Bank and Inter-American Development Bank, they do find it much easier to work with the AIIB. AIIB does approximately 50% of its operations today are co-financed with the World Bank and the ADB. So I think the fear that it will somehow lower standards is not correct. In fact, it has embraced those standards, and it's continuing to work even its own standalone projects with those very high standards.
Thank you very much, Hamid Sharif Saab. Indeed, thousands of years of civilization, Confucian philosophy, integrity and vision of the top leadership, care for citizen are some of the factors that made the China miracle happen. Thank you very much.